सर बुलवाना चाहिए
Want to say something? Yes, you want to say something?
for this beautiful performance.
Please give a round of applause for our
Today we are refugees in India. We have sought political asylum in India. And we run a Central Tibetan administration. Some refer to it as Tibetan government in exile, from Dharamsala in Himachal Pradesh, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama resides, and where the Central Tibetan administration is located, and that is where we function from. But Tibetans today in exile are only about 130,000-40,000 Tibetans. And we are spread across some 26 different countries. Inside Tibet, it's about 7.5 million Tibetans, and now Tibet is occupied by China. That is why we are struggling to free Tibet from the clutches of Chinese invasion and control and surveillance and all that. So I have a small presentation which I can leave here with the school management, because we always talk about bigger things. We talk about global politics, we talk about geopolitics, now we talk about security, geoeconomics and all that. But if you don't understand the basics of what we are talking about, then it's your support or your commitment also remains very shallow. So I thought, because since we have been living here in exile for the last 65 years, along with His Holiness Dalai Lama, and sometimes we imagine that Indians should be knowing about Tibet, because Tibet has been a centuries-old neighbor. But unfortunately, sometimes even today in Delhi, when I meet some of the experts on Tibet, they don't know too many details about Tibet. That is why there are a lot of questions. So I travel around the world. I speak to universities. I've spoken at Oxford. My last engagement 3 weeks back was at Harvard. So we've been reaching out to as many universities as possible. Last few days I was in Guwahati, so I spoke at 4 universities there. And this is my first visit to Lucknow. It's a beautiful city. And we spoke at several, yesterday we spoke at Lucknow University, and today we are here just to give you a little more information about your neighborhood, particularly Tibet. So Tibet, as you can see on that map, it's a satellite image. Sometimes I say we don't need to draw a map, a boundary map around Tibet, because the geography of Tibet itself defines Tibet. So if you don't understand the geography of Tibet, then it's very difficult to understand the history of Tibet and the culture of Tibet, because as you can see from this map taken from the Indian Ocean, Tibet is very high, very high. So we call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges, because we have the Himalayas in the south, and Kunlun, and Karakoram, and Yenchen Tangla, a whole lot of mountains and valleys. And the Tibetan plateau, which is the highest and the biggest plateau on earth, came about because of the tectonic shift between the Indian plate, which is the Gondwanas, and the Eurasian plate, some 50 million years ago. So which means to say that 50 million years ago, Tibet also had a beach. There was an ocean between India and Tibet. So because of the tectonic shift, which is still happening, I just read a geological report a few days ago, which still talks about the ongoing tectonic shift, which results in so many earthquakes from Afghanistan to Burma on the fault lines of Himalayas. So this came about 50 million years ago. Tibetans started living on this land, according to scientists today, about 30,000 years ago. It could date back earlier also if they find older remains. But science is science, so whatever is found, you believe in that. Whatever is not found, you still have to look for it. And it's claimed that Tibetans lived on this plateau for more than 30,000 years ago. And we adapted ourselves to the mountains. So you need a special lung to be able to live in the mountains. So you adapt yourselves and develop this special lung. So then we, Westerners, of course, we had our relations with our neighbors, not so much with too many neighbors, because not many people could come into Tibet. You have to walk all the way. There was no aeroplane, there were no roads, nothing. So the whole mountain system became a defensive mechanism for the Tibetans, and not many foreigners could come into Tibet, not many Tibetans could go out of Tibet, because you have to climb so many mountains, not just the small hills. You're climbing 16, 17,000, 18,000 feet mountains, and then down valleys, and then up mountains. So many of them. It's not just one, not just Himalaya. Himalaya is not just one mountain, right? So we didn't have too many people visiting Tibet. But when foreigners started coming into Tibet, because they considered Tibet as the last frontier where Christianity could not spread. So there were a lot of missionaries trying to come into Tibet from late 16th century to 17th century up to the last century. And they started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Now again, why Tibet is the roof of the world? Because Tibet, the average altitude of Tibet is about 4,880 meters above sea level, and equivalent to that in feet is 16,010 feet, average altitude. So when I go around the world speaking to students, I ask them, which is your highest mountain? Like in Japan, I ask them, what is your highest mountain? They say, Mount Fuji, how high? 3,700, 3,800 meters. I say, that's like base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there, you know. So your highest mountain is base camp in the Himalayas. So, and then according to NASA, it's the highest plateau on Earth, and it's the biggest plateau on Earth, and it's home to Mount Everest, 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet above sea level. And some people believe that Tibet is a very small country. It is not. I was referring to one of the questions by a Pakistani journalist to me asking, which is bigger, Tibet or Bhutan? You need 50 Bhutan to make one Tibet. So, you know, Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers, almost 60-70% of India's size, 1/4 of China, 10 times the UK, maybe 18 times the Japan, 30 times the size of Austria. So it's huge, but the population is very small. Because not all places are habitable. You have deserts, you have grasslands, you have mountains, and you have valleys, so not all places are habitable. So that is why Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Now today, even Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole, because there were some people who coined Tibet as a third pole way back in 1932, but it was not widely used. So today, Chinese environmental scientists also call Tibet the third pole because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost aside from the North Pole and South Pole that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. That is why Tibet is also called as the water tower of Asia. So when you say Tibet the third pole, then it has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost. Then it has, according to UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, they say Tibet has about 46,000 glaciers. And according to Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, they say Tibet has 14,500 cubic kilometers of ice on the Tibetan plateau, right? And today, they call the Tibet's environment, Tibet as the rainmaker. Why rainmaker? Because the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau and the impact of El Nino, which is the warming up of Pacific, decides which are going to be the hot places in Asia, and where the depression is going to set in, and how the rainfall is going to, so whether it's going to increase or not. So Tibet is called the rainmaker. It decides monsoon, not just in India, but in the whole region, in the Asian region. Then now you see more and more of heat waves in Europe, and this will keep increasing. And the heat waves in Europe are caused because of the melting of ice on the Tibetan plateau. Because the melting of ice on the Tibetan plateau is twice the speed of the normal elsewhere in the world, but of course it's 3 times or 4 times on the North Pole and South Pole. So because of the melting of ice, it generates more heat in Europe, and this is going to perpetuate in the future. Just before going to Brazil 2 years ago, I was recently in Mexico. I read a scientific report where the climatologists studied the correlation between Amazonia in Latin America, and which is the lung of the world, and Tibet, the roof of the world. They found this correlation that when there's more rain in Tibet, when there's more snow in Tibet, there is less rain in Amazonia. When there is more rain in Amazonia, there's less snow. So they found this correlation. We live in a very interdependent world, not just on other issues, but also in terms of environment. So today, Tibet is called as the water tower of Asia, because you have the other map, which shows about the river system, the yellow one. Yeah. Here you can see the 2 rivers that flow into Tibet, flow from Tibet to China. Is the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. The Yellow and the Yangtze originate from the Tibetan plateau and flows into China. The Chinese civilization was cradled on the Yellow River. Yeah, you can see from there also. The topmost one is called Huangho in China. It's Machu in Tibet. And then you have the Yangtze originating from Tibet and going into southern China. So these two rivers are lifelines of China. If it is not for these two rivers that originate from Tibet, China cannot support its 1.4 billion people. Then you have the Mekong that originates from Tibet and goes into 5 Southeast Asian countries, to Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And this is the lifeline of all these Southeast Asian countries. Then the Irrawaddy, Salween flows into Burma, the Karnadi flows into Nepal, joins the Ganges, and then you have the Brahmaputra, which originates from western Tibet, goes to eastern Tibet, takes a U-turn, and then comes into Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Bangladesh. Now China is building a mega dam at this place called Methok in Tibet, which is just north of eastern Arunachal Pradesh, not very far, where the Brahmaputra takes a U-turn and falls about 200 meters down. So China wants to use that pressure to produce hydroelectricity, 2.8 times more hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. And Three Gorges is on the Yangtze. That river originates from Tibet and flows into China. So the reason why I talked about the tectonic shift and how the Tibetan plateau was formed and why it is still a seismic zone, if something happens to that size of a dam inside Tibet, it could have catastrophic consequences on downstream areas, including Assam and Bangladesh. These people could be wiped off the face of earth if there is a damage to the dam of that size in Tibet. So China does not share any hydrological data, forget about water sharing with any of its downstream countries because they want to harness every resources inside Tibet. And the countries that I talked about are some of the most densely populated areas in this world, from Pakistan to Nepal to India to Bangladesh to 5 Southeast Asian countries and China. Because China and India alone are 2.8 billion people out of 8 billion, right? So some estimate that between 1.8 to 2 billion people have something or other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. So some say that Third World War could happen because of water. If that is the case, then Tibet is a huge bio hotspot. So right now, downstream countries are not able to speak up to China because they are all economically dependent on China and does not gain the courage to speak up to China. But eventually they will have to, because livelihoods in the downstream countries are already changing. When I go to Cambodia, Thailand, all these in Laos and all, people's livelihoods are changing. They have been dependent on river water system. They have to move away because China uses Tibet's water like a water tap. When there's more water in Tibet, they let it flow, then you have flood downstream. When there's less water, they close the tap, and then you have drought downstream. So it has a lot of implications. We are talking about serious food and water security in the future because all these areas are major food balls of the world. Right, so this is just to give you an idea of what is Tibet, where is Tibet, how big is Tibet, and the population is only 7.5. Now you have more Chinese in Tibet than the Tibetans because there is demographic aggression that has been going on for many years. Right, so this is just an overview of Tibet, just to give you an imagination of what Tibet is. And then I'll give you an overview of the history of Tibet. We have a widely accepted history of Tibet for about 2,200 years, dating back to 127 BC. And I keep saying this because once I was asked in Melbourne, Australia, to speak about India-Tibet relations, and my host started from 7th century. I took it back 9 centuries. The first king of Tibet, Nyati Tsembo, is said to have 2 sources saying that this king has come from India. Some say the king came from Bengal. Some say it was a defeated Kaurav prince. Whatever it is, there is some connection between the first king of Tibet and India. Then between 7th to 9th century, Tibet became a huge empire. China was on the eastern side. China had nothing to do with Tibet, no, the western region of the places they control right now. So Tibet, at that time, between 7th to 9th century was a big power. We even dethroned the Tang emperor, put a puppet king there. We went up to present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. So that used to be extent of Tibetan Empire at one time between 7th to 9th century. And in 7th century, the first religious king of Tibet, he is called the religious king because he had a Chinese princess as his wife and a Nepalese princess as his wife, Wencheng Pongchu and Brikuti Devi. Both of them brought one Buddha statue to Tibet. And that was the initial stage of introduction of Buddhism into Tibet. So this King Songtsen Gampo sent his minister to India, most probably in Srinagar, Kashmir, because Srinagar used to be a hotbed of intellectualism, of Islam, Hindu, Buddhism, and all that. We believe he could have gone to Srinagar, and at that time it was the Gupta period. So the Tibetan script was derived from Devanagari script, for the Gupta and Brahmi script. So if I recount the Tibetan alphabets now, you will find it very similar like Hindi. You know, it's ka kha khanga, cha cha chanya, ta tha thana, pa pa pama, za 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 wa. So some of these consonants you za za, those things you don't have, but za 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 wa, sha sa ya, ra la sha sa ha a. And we have only 4 vowels, e u a o. You have many vowels, a, e, u. I used to learn in school. Aha, tak, you know, so a lot of vowels, but we have only 4 vowels. But Tibetan language is one of the richest languages today. It is one among the 15 oldest languages in this world. Just 2 years back, one of our monks worked with 300 scholars from inside and outside Tibet to work on a Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary. And it's 223 volumes of books from just Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary. So it has become the most voluminous dictionary in the world today. We contributed one to the Library of Congress in the United States last December and one to Czech National Library. It's available in soft copy also. So the importance of the language speaks for itself. So when Shantarakshita and Guru Padmasambhava came to Tibet to preach Buddhism for the first time in 8th century, Shantarakshita suggested, now that you have your own script, instead of me teaching you Buddhism in Sanskrit or Pali, why don't you translate everything into Tibetan? And that's exactly what the Tibetans did. For 5 long centuries, between 9th to 8th to 13th century, before Buddhism almost vanished out of India, we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan. So we have the 110 volumes of Buddha's teaching, 220 volumes of the commentaries by Indian Pandits on Buddha's teachings. Now we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of volumes of books written by Tibetan masters having experimented on the Buddha's teachings. So now we have more than 100,000 titles, and we are in the process of digitalizing all of it so that we can make it available to the whole world. And we are proud to be repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom. Yeah. So, and having maintained it in its pristine quality, not even Chinese, no other languages have that. And in fact, today we are in the process of getting it back into Sanskrit, into its original text. So even though Sanskrit is not very widely used, so that speaks for our connection, our linguistic connection, having come from, because Tibet is controlled by China, and some people ask us, oh, do your language have something to do with it? We have nothing to do with Chinese language. It's everything to do with the script came from India. So from 9th to 13th century, we went through a political crisis because we had a disintegration for about 400 years. There was not a single ruler who could control the whole of Tibet. But during those periods, many Tibetans came to India, walked over the Himalayas to seek Indian masters and study and then go back to Tibet. So that is what our people did. And they came out with new traditions like Sakya tradition or Kagyu traditions. Earlier, what was there was Nyingma tradition, the oldest tradition. So many other forms of different traditions in Tibet established, Buddhist traditions. I mentioned this because I was just coming from Guwahati, and when I was there in that region for some years ago, I found this piece of history. in 1206, after Bhaktiar Khilji destroyed Nalanda and Otantapuri and Vikramashila and all that in this region, Bhaktiar Khilji sent an army of 10,000 people into Tibet from northeast India, from Kush Bihar, and only 100 returned back. So which means even at the fag end of our disintegration, when Tibet should have been not so very organized, our border was well protected. If Bhaktiar Khilji had managed to come into Tibet, he would have destroyed Buddhism in Tibet. Then today you won't have Buddhism in Mongolia, Buddhism in Russia, because Buddhism in Mongolia and Russia all went from Tibet. So even today, Russian Buddhists, Mongolian Buddhists come to Dharamsala to listen to His Holiness. So we built those connections. Of course, spread of Buddhism started during Kanishka's time in 2nd century to Afghanistan and Central Asia. But from Tibet, it spread to Mongolia and other. But today, China is distorting those facts. China is saying the Tibetan Buddhism went from China. They like to claim everything as their own. Even if they wish, they would claim that Buddha was born in China. That's what they would do, unfortunately. So then we developed relations with the Mongols because Genghis Khan was becoming a big power by the beginning of 13th century. And we surrendered to the Khans. And the Khans were merciless. They used to kill everybody. If they have to invade Delhi, they come to Lucknow, they kill everybody in Lucknow. By the time you reach Delhi, everybody surrenders for fear of being decimated. And that's how ruthless Mongolians used to be. But they were looking for a spiritual master. So they found one in the form of Sikyong Penpa Tsering in Tibet. So he was invited to preach the Mongols. And from that time onwards, he and his nephew, Dzongwe Chögye Phakwa, they became the preceptors to the Khans. And we became the religious leaders, just like we consider India as our guru and ourselves as Chela. We developed this Guru-Chela relationship with India. And then we became gurus to the Mongols, and Mongols became our chelas. So even today, some of the Mongols it's you Tibetans who turned us into Buddhists. Otherwise, we were warriors at one time. Of course, anybody can be warrior at one time, So we developed our relations with the Mongols, and Mongols protect Tibetans, and we provide spiritual guidance to the Mongols. That used to be the arrangement, priest-patron relationship. And then Mongols invaded China in 1271. Kublai Khan invaded China in 1271, and the Mongols ruled China up to 1368. And that period, from 1271 to 1368 in Chinese history, is called the Yuan period, Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N. And they ruled from China. So it's Mongols who ruled China, not China who conquered Mongol or conquered Tibet. So it was a totally different story at that time. But now, today, Chinese government claims that Tibet became part of China because 7th century, one Tibetan king married a Tibetan princess. So in that case, Nepal can also claim its sovereignty on Tibet because the same king had a Nepalese princess. So they use all kind of justification to claim their territorial sovereignty over Tibet, which is hogwash. There's no basis for that. So when it comes to history, China is on very thin ice. That is why we are trying to focus on history more, right? And then Mongols in China were overthrown by the Ming Chinese. Mings are real Han Chinese. But we had no relation for 280 years when they ruled China between 1368 to 1644. We have our own rulers, and we had nothing much to do with the Chinese. But our relations with the Mongols continued up to 1270. And when the 5th Dalai Lama took over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet in 1642, 2 years before the Qings overthrew the Mings in China, and the Qings are Manchus, they're from Manchuria. The Chinese don't consider Manchu as Chinese. So there have been a lot of academic discourses as to who is a real Chinese. Is only the Han Chinese? If they claim that Mongols are Chinese, then maybe they can claim half of the world because Mongols went that far, right, in conquest. So Manchu, if you watch Chinese Kung Fu movies, you will find, do you watch Kung Fu movies? Not just Kung Fu, just that, not, of course, Kung Fu movies don't have too much storyline behind it, just fight, fight, fight. But if there is some storyline, then you will find that all the heroes are Chinese. All the Dakus are Manchus. So the societal perspective of the Chinese people as Manchus are not Chinese. They are invaders from the north, right, close to Japan. So Qings ruled China from 1644 to 1911. And successive Dalai Lamas ruled Tibet from 1642 to the present day, till we lost our independence to China. So again, beginning of last century, 1900s, again we suffered because British India came into Tibet. Have you heard about the Young Husband expedition into Tibet? That is when British India decided that China does not have any influence on the Tibetans, because they were trying to deal with China behind us, behind Tibetans not knowing what the British India is doing with Chinese. The Tibetans are not informed of whether it's to do with 1876 Shefu Convention or the 1890, 1893 treaties between UK, British India and China. Because there was this fight. British always feared that Russia might attack Tibet. And the Russians feared that British might exercise their influence more in Tibet. So then they came into Tibet. They invaded Tibet up to Lhasa, and the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee into Mongolia. And then he went to China from there. And we were attacked from the northwestern side by the Chinese warlord called Ma Bufang, from the eastern side by another Qing dynasty general. So we were attacked from all sides by the beginning of 20th century. And then, of course, the British went back. The Chinese were also on the border. And when His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama came back from China by December 1909, 3 months after that, again the Chinese started coming from eastern Tibet. Then the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee into India, met with Lord Curzon, and he stayed in and around Darjeeling for about 2 years. And within those periods, the Qing dynasty had fallen. By 1911, Qing dynasty had fallen, nationalist movement took over, and then it was successive Kuomintang government, the civil war with communists that went up to 1948. But Tibet was untouched. So His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama went back to Tibet in 1912-13, reiterated Tibet's independence with Mongolia, and then we also signed the 1914 Shimla Agreement. Have you heard about the Shimla Agreement, the McMahon Line? Because McMahon Line is part of that Shimla Agreement. That McMahon Line was decided in Shimla Agreement, and Tibetans were the signatory to that document along with British India as an independent nation. Even Nepal claimed its entry into United Nations because of its treaty relations with Tibet. So this went on. By 1949, Kuomintang, or the nationalist movement, were defeated by the communists, and the communists took over control in China. So no sooner did they take control of the whole of China, they started invading Tibet from east. By 1950 October, they were at a garrison called Chamdo. We were only 10,000 army, and they sent 40,000 from 3 directions and defeated the Tibetan. We never focused on military. Our minds were always in religion, Buddhism, monastery, all that. Once you become a monk, you become a monk for life. You study Buddhist philosophy all through your life. It's not just few months like in Thailand and other countries, So this is just a brief, before going to Guwahati, and here we had an evening program with Shiv Shankar Menanji, C. Raja Mohan and others, Dilip Sinha, to commemorate the 75th year of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama assuming the temporal and spiritual leadership on November 17, 1950. So this is the 75th year. So we celebrated that. And November 1950, Tibet was still independent, even though China had started attacking from the east. We were independent. And His Holiness was only 15 years old. How many of you are 15 years old? All are above 15. 15? Are you 15? So you can imagine what we were doing at the age of 15. So His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama had to take over the spiritual and temporal leadership at the age of 15 when we were going through a very, very critical stage in our history when China started invading, and then, we had no outside support whatsoever. So His Holiness took the responsibility. Then he had to come to the Indian border because the Chinese army were coming from the east, just in case His Holiness had to seek asylum. So anyway, he went back and we tried to live under the so-called 17-point agreement that was forced upon us on the threat of war and also personal safety to the people who were there to sign the documents, to deal with negotiate with the Chinese in Beijing. And His Holiness, the stamp, official stamp was with His Holiness. They forged a stamp in Beijing and put it on that 17-point document. His Holiness tried to live under that document for 8 long years and went to China in 54, 55 and met with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai. His Holiness was just 19 years old, along with Panchen Lama. They went to China, they saw communist China, everything looked very orderly, but people didn't have the freedom to speak their mind. And 1956-57, His Holiness came to India for the first time during the 2500 Buddha Jayanti on the invitation of the Buddhist Society of India, under difficult circumstances. And he visited the Indian Parliament just 10 years after independence, nascent democracy. Everything looked very chaotic in the Indian Parliament, but everybody had the freedom to speak their mind. So His Holiness was very much influenced by democracy. And when we had to come into exile in 1959, His Holiness stepped on Indian soil on 31st March 1959. Came through Arunachal, then went to Tezpur, met with the international media for the first time, then came to Mussoorie, stayed for 1 year, and then we were moved to Dharamsala, where we are located today. And we never thought that we would have to live in exile for so long. Because people thought 13th Dalai Lama, 2 years, we managed to go back. So even during 14th Dalai Lama, a few years, we will manage to go back. Even in the 80s, when I told my father I want to plant some trees, he was saying, why you plant trees? We'll have to go back to Tibet. So they always have this thinking that we'll go back to Tibet very soon. Never thought that we would have to live in exile for 65 long years and still going on. Right? So this is where we are. After His Holiness came into exile, he introduced democracy, and we exist only because of the benevolence and the generosity of the government of India. If it is not for the government of India, we don't exist as a government in exile, right? Or Central Tibetan administration. So, of course, we would have wished much more political support, but then, of course, everybody has their expediencies and their national interests at heart. And at that time, Pandit Nehru had a very idealistic view of the world with non-alignment movement and all that. So whatever, if you look back, given the benefit of hindsight, you can always say that this could have done that way or this way, but past is past. So the first fault was ours, that we were not able to defend ourselves. We focused, there was no focus on defense of, military defense of Tibet. We remained isolated for too long. We didn't reach out to the international community for a very long time. China took advantage of that. British India took advantage of that. And when the whole world was gaining independence after Second World War, when many countries were decolonized, including India, Tibet fell under the envelope of communism that was spreading in Russia and China. And we were absorbed by communist China. So today, Tibet is an occupied state. So because of His Holiness' vision, he introduced democracy as early as 1960. So we have been practicing democracy for the last 65 years. First 30 years was difficult because our people had no idea what democracy meant, what organs, institutions you need to run a democracy. But we built every single institution one by one over the last 65 years. And today, we are the only exile community with a fully functional democratic polity. No other exile community has that. So we have our parliament with 45 members. We have our Supreme Justice Commission, which handles more of civil and administrative cases. We don't handle criminal cases because we have to conform to Indian laws. So if it's a criminal case, it goes to Indian police and Indian court. But anything to do within Tibetan community, we resolve it. We do follow all due processes of law, but it functions more like an arbitration rather than a court. And then we have our election commission, we have our public service commission, we have our auditor general's office, we have very strict audit. That's why I keep saying that we have zero corruption in our system, and also the fact that there's not much money for corruption. And we hold election in one day all over the world, in 26 different countries. Now Tibetans are scattered in 26 different countries, and we have an ongoing election for my post, the Sikyong, and for the Member of Parliament. Every 5 years we do that. And that is why because of His Holiness' vision, even an ordinary person like me could be the elected political leader today. And now that His Holiness has reached 90 years of age, we celebrated his 90th birthday, and he does not travel as much as he used to do before, so we have to do all the legwork. So I keep traveling about 7 months a year internationally within India, visit every Tibetan community in 26 different countries to keep our flock together, even though we are becoming physically distant, emotionally, to keep our people emotionally close if we have to continue the movement in the times to come. So this is, again, a brief introduction of how we are organized in India and as an exile government, or what we call as Central Tibetan Administration. Now, what is happening inside Tibet? 7.5 million Tibetans. The political freedom that you take it for granted here in India does not exist in the whole of Tibet. The biggest plateau on earth has become the biggest open-air prison in this world today. You just can't go to Tibet. Try to get a visa to go to Tibet. Apply for a visa. You will know. You will find out for yourself. So what the US government did was pass a law called the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, because the norm of diplomacy is reciprocity, right? So if a Chinese citizen has a visa to go to the United States, then he can or she can visit any part of the United States. Whereas if a US citizen has a visa to go to China, to go to Tibet, you need a special permit. It's like going to a third country. That's how China restricts entry of foreigners. Forget about media. Even if media are taken, they are taken on conducted tours. They cannot go on their own. They will want you to write what they tell you to write. So whether you conform to that or not is a different matter, right? And diplomats are hardly allowed to visit Tibet. Or some ordinary people manage, those who speak well of communism, good of China, they let them make some YouTubers that promote as their propaganda to speak good about China. But otherwise the reality is different, right? So there's no political system. If you have, maybe you have not even heard of George Orwell's 1984, but when you grow up, if you happen to read that book, George Orwell's 1984, it's more like George Orwell's 1984 has come into reality in China, where the state surveils and controls every citizen of China. It's not just the Tibetans. Every single person in China has been turned into a QR code or a barcode, because now you use cards for all payments. There's no cash payment in China. They've done away with that. So they can track all your transactions. If you do anything out of the ordinary, you could be blacklisted, and then your life is gone. The level of espionage at the ground level, at the local level. I was telling another professor who was with me, belonging to another university, but if we say that Pawan Singh ji and we have been friends, let us say, during our university days, and now we are meeting after 20, 30 years, he cannot open up to me about his political views. I cannot do the same with him, because if I do that, he could inform me to the authorities. He'll get rewarded, but I'll go to jail. Vice versa, same thing. That is the level of fear. Because if you have heard about SS of East Germany, wife spies over husband, husband over the children, children over the parents. That used to be the level of paranoia in East Germany those days. Maybe it's not to that level, but inside Tibet there is a lot of level of fear of expressing yourselves. So if you even own a small picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you go to jail. You say, long live Dalai Lama, you go to jail. It's so strict. What you take it for granted does not exist in Tibet. And the whole system is so gridlocked you know, we had big demonstrations inside Tibet. Every time it was violently curbed. From 2009 to 2022, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated, put their kerosene and oil on themselves and burnt them. It's not like Tibetans cannot kill Chinese. We can. But His Holiness kept saying that if Tibetans take up violence, I will no more be responsible for the Tibetan cause. And also it goes against the ideology of Buddhism. So we refrain from violence. So you burn oneself to express your angst, your frustration, hoping against hope that there will be some attention from the Chinese government on the Tibetan plight, or hoping against hope that there will be some support from the international community. But unfortunately, China is very good in making sure that there's no evidence. So even today, if something happens in Tibet, if somebody sends that footage out, then you go to jail. Even non-political things, natural fire in a forest, you are not allowed to send that out. So control on information is very, very strict, and China uses all kinds of artificial intelligence, whether it's to do with DNA. They are collecting DNA of every single Tibetan. So today, if I'm in Tibet and if I think about self-immolating myself, I have to think 100 times, because through DNA testing, they can track all my relatives. And then all my relatives become the first line of suspicion. So it's not just me who suffers. It's like Hindi movie, what the Dakus used to do at the end of, you tie up the family of the hero, heroine, and all that. That's exactly what the Chinese government does at a state level, at the level of state. That's Gundaism. China is the biggest bully in this world. In international politics, I'm not joking. You don't need to believe whatever I say today, but you have to read more to verify whether what I'm saying is true or not. Right? And there's no religious freedom at all. Children today in schools cannot go to monasteries. If you are a member of Communist Party, you cannot visit a monastery. The number of monks and nuns in independent Tibet goes into hundreds and thousands in one monastery, which we have replicated in India. If you visit Hubli or if you visit Mysore, we have Tibetan settlements with more than 5,000, 6,000 monks in one monastery, which used to be there in Tibet. Today, it is reduced to 250 to 300 in these big monasteries. Children below the age of 18 cannot become monks. If you want to become a monk, you need at least 4 guarantors to make sure, to guarantee that this person will not commit any political crime in the monastery. So that is the level of control. If the monks and nuns have to go out of their territory, they need at least 4 or 5 different permits. The curriculum of the Buddhist studies are being set up by communist government that does not believe in any religion. Management of the monasteries and nunneries have been taken over by multiple security agencies. There are multiple security agencies in China and in Tibet. So now they want to be responsible for recognizing reincarnated lamas. So that's the level China is. And this is aimed at the 15th Dalai Lama. They are not bothered about the living 14th Dalai Lama here in India. They are more bothered about the yet to come 15th, because they know that if they can control the 15th Dalai Lama, then they can control Tibet and Tibetan people. So in fact, they are the ones who are politicizing the whole thing. But on the other hand, they accuse the Dalai Lama of politicizing his reincarnation. So it's Dalai Lama who is going to be reincarnated. It's not the Chinese government. So that's why His Holiness always has very wise and humorous ways of responding to this. When the Chinese government says that they will be responsible for the final recognition of the reincarnated lamas, what they call as living Buddhas, then His Holiness says, if Chinese government is really serious, they should study Buddhism first. Believe in the concept of life after death. If you don't believe in Punarjanam and all that, you cannot have reincarnation. Right? The whole concept is based on life after death. And then His Holiness jokingly says, if Chinese government really serious, they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first. You didn't get the joke, right? Mao Zedong is no more with us. And he was a communist leader. He was the founder of Chinese communists, right? He is no more. So if Chinese, instead of looking for Dalai Lama's reincarnation, they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation, if they are really serious. Then they should look for Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation. Then Jiang Zemin. Then maybe the Dalai Lama. This is how His Holiness used to respond to this difficult question. And China has two other positions. They say that, oh, we will look for the next Dalai Lamas because His Holiness is 90 now. So they think that he will die pretty soon. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama keeps saying, I will live for another 2 decades and more. And from this Tibetan New Year, His Holiness says, I will live up to 130 years of age. So I keep telling our Chinese friends, this message is for you, because you were waiting for this Dalai Lama to die more than 20 years ago. And this Dalai Lama keeps saying, I will live long, right? So let us see whether communism outlives the Dalai Lama or Dalai Lama outlives the communism. So we keep talking about that. Then Tibetan way of life is dictated by your thinking, your philosophy based on Buddhism. So we are not different. Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, we all think alike because the root is the same. So even when we are born here, live with Indians, we feel no different. I keep saying I look a little different, but I'm an Indian because I was born here, and I consider myself as a Kannadiga, you know. They say, na manina maga. Now, Manina Maga means I am the son of the soil, just like Devagoda used to say in Karnataka. That used to be a slogan. So this is the situation inside Tibet. I'm not going into every detail, but just to give you an overview. Now, how are we trying to resolve this? His Holiness came out with this. Initially, we were fighting for independent Tibet because historically Tibet was an independent state. And then till 1973. Then from 73 onwards, His Holiness started thinking about a new way of approaching this and suggested the middle way, which is Buddhist philosophy, the Madhyama, right? So when His Holiness says middle way, which means asking for genuine autonomy, and why His Holiness added genuine to that is because Tibet is already known as Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Prefecture, Tibet Autonomous County, in all the 3 provinces of Tibet. So when the law gives a lot of provisions for the nationalities, in terms of implementation, China is the worst. If you read Chinese constitution, you will find that China's constitution is one of the best constitutions in this world. If you look at the national regional autonomy under that 1982 constitution, which was made in 1984, that provides for a lot of rights for the minorities, including the right to your religion and language and all that. But in terms of implementation, it's not there. So you have the elephant's tusk to show to the world that it's a nice constitution, but the real teeth is the Communist Party constitution. So if you have to understand China, you have to understand structure of Chinese administration also. You have the Communist Party, then you have the People's Congresses at parallel. And then whenever it comes to decision making, it's always the Communist Party. Particularly after Xi Jinping came into power, if you think that you are meeting a minister and you are talking with the government, you are wrong. Because behind every government ministry, there is a commission that decides that makes all the decisions, including policy decisions. So people whom you meet as government officials are no more than just parrots in the hands of the communist structure. So this is how it works, and when His Holiness says middle, then there has to be end to it. It could be multiple ends. It could be multidimensional. But if we concentrate only on the political side, then one end is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. And the other end is the current situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. In between these two, we are asking for genuine autonomy, not only in name, but also in practice. Right? So there have been not much positive reaction from the Chinese side. There have not been much traction from the Chinese side, even though there was some dialogue between 2008 to 2010 between the representative of His Holiness and the Chinese government. Then after that, once the Olympic was over, their purpose was served, and then the dialogue was also discontinued. So from 2010 till now, we don't have meaningful dialogue. We do have some kind of back channels. I send my people to meet with them, but that does not amount to anything. It's of nothing of consequence. If you look at the larger policy that Chinese government is adopting under the President Xi Jinping, his whole idea is if there are no nationalities, it's more like if Lucknowis are giving problem, If there are no Lucknowis, there will be no Lucknow problem. So it's like that. If there are no Tibetans, there won't be Tibetan issue. That is the whole idea of how Chinese government. So on that basis, they cannot kill all the Tibetans. It would amount to genocide, right? So what they are doing is they are striking at the very root of our identity, the Tibetan language, Tibetan religion, Tibetan culture. So when they strike at Tibetan culture, you should also feel the pain because our culture is part of Indian culture, which I already mentioned, as a repository of Indian culture. So one of your, that's why we always say India has a lot of soft power. It's not being used properly. Hinduism spread to so many countries, Buddhism is spread to so many countries, but India is not able to leverage those soft powers as much as we would have liked India to do. So at one time, one of my predecessors, Professor Samdong Rinpoche, said, अब हम इंडिया को ये याद दिला रहे हैं कि जैसे राम जी ने हनुमान को याद दिलाया था कि आप संजीवनी ला सकते हैं, जब लक्ष्मणा को तो रिम्पुचे ने कहा कि आज हम भारत को याद दिला रहे हैं कि आपके सॉफ्ट पावर बहुत ज़्यादा है, आप छलांग लगा सकते हैं. So this is what we are trying to do. So when I reach out to nations, leaders, governments, parliamentarians, so what we tell them is if you keep one message we have to send clearly to the world and to China, mainly to the Chinese government, is that they cannot distort history. Whether it's in an individual person's life, yesterday was yesterday, it's in the past. In a nation also, past is past. You just on the whims and fancies of one or two politicians, you cannot change history. You cannot distort history. And that is what we are telling the Chinese government, that you cannot change Tibetan history. You cannot distort Tibetan history, and we'll work with the world to turn that around. That's why I carry these two books with me. I show to the foreign officers and tell them, have you read Tibetan history? To make this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, because China is forcing every country to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, right? So I tell governments that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, you are going against international law. You can call Tibet an occupied state, yes, this is the current state, because China had occupied Tibet. But if you just give a general statement, just as Chinese government wants everybody to say that Tibet is part of PRC, you are going against international law, because there's only one international law after Second World War. And what happened to Tibet 75 years ago and what's happening to Ukraine with Russia's invasion is the same situation. There are no two international laws. This is one point we try to tell the international community. The second point I tell the international community is that on the one hand, they keep repeating the statement, Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, like a parrot. I call them parrots, because they didn't use their mind when they made the statement. And then on the other hand, they keep saying that we appreciate negotiations between the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. These two positions, I tell them, are contradictory. You are contradicting yourself. How? When every country keeps saying Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? You are removing the very foundation for dialogue, very ground for dialogue, which we are trying to seek. When we say middle way, we are trying to seek a non-violent, negotiated, mutually beneficial solution that would be lasting. If you look at conflicts around the world, particularly in Gaza, Ukraine, and all that, whether they are resolving one problem now or are they creating more problems for future, nobody knows. So non-violence is the best and the only means to resolve conflicts that could be lasting. So we are not asking for independence. Sometimes Chinese government calls Dalai Lama a separatist, they now even call me a separatist. I caution them. I tell them, who really wants Tibet to be separated from China? Because His Holiness keeps chanting like a mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, just like you are hung there, Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra, which we recite all the time to invoke the Lord of compassion in you. His Holiness have been saying middle way, middle way, middle way for ages now. And Chinese government keeps calling him separatist, separatist, separatist. Now, who really wants Tibet to be separated from China? Is it His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the Chinese government? Because they don't know what they are talking about. And the third thing we tell the international community is that why do you think Chinese government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China? Do you see any other cases around this world where one country asks another country to say that this is part of us, that you support it? Nobody has done that. That is why this Chinese professor, he's a Chinese professor who now lives in San Diego, and when he was going in school, the Chinese government used to teach them that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Now, they themselves don't know when it's ancient times, right? And then when he was in his university days, he found that the Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. So even though he's a Chinese, his conscience didn't agree with him. So he became a professor for life, and then he finished that. After he retired, he went on the Communist China's website and downloaded all imperial Chinese historical records from 1271 to 1911, the three dynasties from Yuan to Ming to Qing, and he wrote this book. This is not written in a historical format. It's more an argument as to how Tibet is not part of China. And he proves that because imperial China are known for having a very meticulous system of history, because they revise history of the previous dynasty. So that's how it's laid. So if you look at the imperial Chinese historical records, imperial China, if you can consider the Mongols and Manchus also as Chinese, he proves that imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. And Chinese government has not been able to respond to this because the sources are all Chinese. And the other book which I carry is this Tibet Brief 2020, written by one of our friends, Michael Van Wall from Prague, and his partner, Meek Balthius. They are also in San Diego, in US. And they are experts on international law. So they looked at Tibet from an international legal perspective before the end of Second World War and the formation of United Nations and international law defining what a modern nation state should be, and the systems that preceded in different parts of the world, different systems are there of sovereignty, right? So he worked with some 70, 80 scholars from Central Asia, not just from Tibet, with some 60, 70 scholars for about 6 years, and came out with this book. And he proves that according to international law, Tibet is never considered as part of China. So there are other books written by Indians also. Former MEA Secretary Nirupama Rao had written a book called Fractured Himalayas that talks about the most recent events starting from mid-19th century, mid-20th century. Then Dalip Sinha, who is a former ambassador, who was with me at the panel in Delhi last time, he had written a book called The Imperial Games in China. So if you want to understand a little more about the intricacies of politics at that time, by 1906, the great game was almost over because the sphere of influence of the British and the Russians were defined. And even today, people are talking about spheres of influence, spheres of security, all kinds of concepts and notions. So I won't go into all that. So this is one thing we tell the international community. And we worked with the US Congress for 2 years, from 2022 to 2024, to get a law passed, because the United States is the only government that has a law on Tibet, called the US Tibet Policy of 2002. Now that has been amended to Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020, wherein they have also mentioned about His Holiness reincarnation, that any Chinese official who will involve themselves in choosing the next Dalai Lama would be sanctioned. So in which sense that law has a little teeth in it. Let us see how it evolves when the time comes. And so we are working with other like-minded countries around the globe. We can reach out only to democratic free countries. We cannot reach out to authoritarian governments because they follow the same as China, being the biggest bully and a friend for them. So this is how we try to reach out. We have got this Resolve Tibet Act passed in the United States, which has become a law, because China keeps saying that there is no Tibet problem. They keep saying Tibet is a socialist paradise. So United States law says that Tibet is yet to be resolved conflict, and it needs to be resolved under international law. The second part of the law talks about Tibetan people's right to self-determination, which is very much in line with the 1961 UN General Assembly resolution on Tibet. And then the third part of that law talks about the history part. China's disinformation, misinformation on Tibetan history. US does not accept that China's narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Then the fourth part of the law talks about the territory of Tibet, which consists not only of Tibet Autonomous Region, but all the 3 provinces. In India also, many of the newspapers, when they publish the map of Tibet, they publish only Tibet Autonomous Region. That's only half of Tibet, and that is what China talks about. And they call it Xizang. When they say Xizang, it covers only Tibet Autonomy. Maybe I'm going too much into technicalities now, so let me get out of this. So this is how we try to reach out, ask governments for their support. And here in India, the reason why I'm here is because the first generation, when His Holiness came into exile, everybody knows about Tibet. You know, what we have been through, whether there should be support, no support, whatever. We went through all this in history. Now, after 65 years, you, the future generation, the future leaders of India, if you have not even heard about Tibet, then that's the worst case scenario for us. But at least if you hear a little bit about Tibet today, have a little imprint on your mind, then you can develop slowly by your own thinkings and analysis and studies and expand on what I have said. I'm just sowing the seed today in your mind. Now it depends on you whether you want to put water or air or sun or you let it die. It's up to you. But as an Indian, there was never ever an India-China border till Chinese occupation of Tibet. So for the first time since China's occupation of Tibet, you have a border with China. But I keep saying, because people keep asking us, what is India's government position? I keep saying, okay, Indian government has still not changed the name from Indo-Tibetan Border Police to Indo-Sino-Indian Border Police. It's still the Indo-Tibetan Border Police and Indo-Tibetan Border Force. If India wants, they could have changed it any time. But they purposely did not change it to keep the historical facts intact. So that speaks for itself. Of course, if we go into details about what India is doing, how India is doing, that'll be very complicated. I always say I'm in no position to advise the Indian government. There are a lot of smart people up there. We just do our job and we work transparently with the government of India at all levels where we need to work and seek their support, and we always remain very grateful to that. Now, if I don't speak about this, my presentation would not be complete, because I keep traveling around the world, including some countries in Latin America. And some of my friends in India say, why you are going to Latin America? You won't get any government support. You know, but that's not the whole purpose. If there has to be awareness on China, it has to come from everywhere. Because Latin America does not understand China. I went to several universities like Itasco University, Guadalajara University, Mexico University, of course met with some politicians, met with local leaders, and I keep asking them, have you heard about Belt and Road Initiative? They all shake their hand, they go like this. Then I say, you understand nothing about China. You know, so one has to understand the motivations of China, the larger ambitions of China, what China is doing, and also to understand the vulnerabilities of China, because people believe that China is monolith, is so big, is so, orderly, people can't go against the government and all that. That's not really the truth. China has become the second largest economy. Yes, they have uplifted many from the lower income group to middle income group. Yes, there have been quite a number of developments, and all that. Livelihood issues have also been raised. And the younger generation like yours, or some who are a little older to you, they have seen their parents in one lifetime from where to where they went. And the children want to do better than their parents. But unfortunately today, the economic environment within China is not conducive for young to dream big. It is decelerating. China has housing collapse. I was speaking to another professor, he has not heard about that. It's 25 to 30% of China's GDP. We are talking about a 19 trillion GDP. China has a GDP of 19 trillion, US has 30, India is still 5. So we'll go forward, right? So in a 19 trillion economy, you have 25% to 30% of investment in housing. And then suddenly the housing collapse. And the big companies like Evergrande, and they all close down, and there's a complete meltdown. Right? So this is a huge component of China's GDP. It's not a small amount. And the government used policy, fiscal policy, and a lot of other things, but they were not able to lift that problem. They changed the policy from buying one house to 2 houses and some subsidies, but it didn't improve. The domestic consumption is still very, very poor. So how much they produce and how much they sell within the country is the lowest in the world. You're talking about 40, 50% in China, 60, 70% domestic consumption in the rest of the world. That's still very low. So China's growth is dependent on export and the economy of scale. Right? So they produce so many EV electric vehicles and millions of electric vehicles. And they formed new shipping lines to export all this. But then the West started putting up tariffs. So they have a problem now. And if you remember, first time President Trump imposed tariff on China, Xi Jinping went to Cambodia, he went to Vietnam, he went to Malaysia, initially to gain support to fight against the Americans on tariffs. Of course, there was no support. They themselves had to struggle with the United States on negotiating the tariff. And the second ambition was to make sure that these countries in Southeast Asia don't raise tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, after several months, we can see, you look at numbers, the imports of Chinese goods into Southeast Asia has increased by 20-30% in the last few months. In Europe also, it's increasing. In India also increased. Just day before yesterday in Economic Times, I read that India's export to China is growing up and the deficit has been reduced to 64 billion. Even 64 billion for India's size is a huge amount. And I was in Mexico, and Mexico sells only 10 to 15 billion to China and buys 130 billion from China. So they're talking about 115 billion trade deficit with China every single year. And you're talking about more than 300 billion trade deficit of US with China. That is why US is imposing all these tariffs. Then $400+ billion from the 27 EU nations with China. They export only 200 and import 600. So they have a deficit of 400. So if you add up all this, then China has this surplus of $1 trillion plus. It is already about to cross $1 trillion for this year. Now, starting from the first quarter, it has been increasing because the tariffs were stalled for 3 months with US, so people buy in more. That's why you have more imports from China to other countries like United States, but this cannot be sustained in the long run. The overcapacity of China cannot be sustained because if China is looking at global south for its market, but then again the question is how much purchasing power does the global south have? So China has a lot of unemployment problem. Between the age of 16 to 24, now they are saying the percentage has reached 18.9% of unemployment in China, which is more than 10 million Chinese young children who are unemployed. Every single year you have 11, 12 million new Chinese graduates who needs to be given job. Now they are not getting enough job. 3 long years of COVID, there was no income. And whatever savings they had, they spent it on housing and other investments. So people don't have enough money to buy. And then China is the only country that has a deflationary trend, whereas in the whole rest of the world, prices are increasing. You have inflation everywhere. But China, there's too much competition because of the overproduction. Because of the overproduction, too much competition, prices are going down and down and down. Then it impacts the companies because companies have to make money. So when companies have to make the money, they reduce the wages. Then the income is less with the public. So spending again becomes less. So it has this cyclical impact in economics as to how this works. So China today is in a very vulnerable stage, but they have become brazen. During Deng Xiaoping's time, they would say, "Oh, hide your strength. Don't show your strength. Even if you are strong, don't say I'm strong." So bide your time. Wait for the right time to do that. Today's China thinks that they can do anything they want. So there, even one consul general in Osaka, in Japan, is talking about beheading the Japanese PM because the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said something about Taiwan. That is the level of intolerance, and the wolf warrior is coming back now into Chinese. When it comes to the United States, they would say, "Oh, the United States is not treating us equal." But when China's relation with India, does China treat India equal? You ask any politicians, you ask any diplomats, you would know. They don't treat you equal. So there are double standards with China all the time, all the time. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities. In political terms, it's a very opaque system. It's very difficult to find out what changes are happening. But if you watch over a longer period, particularly during Xi Jinping's time, there have been unprecedented purges of leaders, including people whom he himself appointed in the rocket forces, let us say. The top generals were appointed by Xi Jinping himself. And now, after a few years, he had to kick them out in the name of anti-corruption. Now, he has been fighting anti-corruption for the last 12 years in China. And under the communist system, you could have done it easily, but the corruption is so entrenched that Xi Jinping had to, of course, one of the means is to make sure that all of his opponents are wiped out. Then again, of course, strikes with people who don't follow his orders. So those things are still happening. 9 generals were kicked out at one time, just before the plenum last month, or 2 months back. And among the 9 generals is the second top. Xi Jinping is the chairman of Central Military Commission. The second is He Weidong. He has been kicked out. Mei Hua, the political commissar, has been kicked out. And 2 other people out of the 9 people, one is the Eastern Command commander, one is the Southern Command commander. Eastern Command is responsible for Taiwan. That's why some people ask me, "Oh, do you think China will attack Taiwan?" I say, China is not ready yet. They are not ready to attack Taiwan. You must have heard reports about Chinese missile stations filled with oil, not oil or petrol to push that, but water. That is the level of corruption. So tomorrow, if there is a war, they put fire to that missile, it won't burst. Because it's water inside, not fuel. So that's the level of corruption we are talking about in China. So there is a lot of vulnerabilities on China, and even on political level. We are watching. Sometimes we try to get inside news because otherwise it's very difficult to understand the changes that. But policies, you can make it out very easily. So what China does with its hegemonic ambitions, they first invaded Tibet, the Uyghur, East Turkestan, Mongolia, Tibet in the 4950s. That shows the true colors of a colonialist. They were saying Vistarvadi. They follow Vistarvadi. And they want more and more territories. In the South China Sea, they've put 9 lines and then 9 dash lines. This is all ours. Going up to the border of Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, all these countries. So that you have problem with all your neighboring countries. So because of China's hegemonic ambitions, Japan had to change its policy during Shinzo Abe's time. Japan was a pacifist state after the Second World War. Now they have to spend money to defend themselves on weapons. For Taiwan, it's an existential problem because they are always threatened by invasion, war, so they have to spend more. I have been to New Zealand. At that time, security was never an issue. Now it is one because Chinese are hacking their parliament and all those things. And then Australia, for the first time, is spending about $360 billion to buy 7 nuclear submarines. To protect against whom? China. Philippines has this perennial problem with China on the Scarborough Shoals. So they have this fight, and Philippines has to spend more money on defense even though US Army is based there. And Malaysia, Indonesia trying to play the safe game Vietnam is also spending a lot of money on building artificial isles because China is doing the same. And to stake their claim on the spread list, they have to do that. And I traveled from Arunachal Pradesh to Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh. Now, how much Indian government is spending on protecting the Himalayas? It was not that, that was not the case before. Now it is. It's all happening because of China's hegemonic ambitions. And when China has this $1 trillion, then they spend it on space technology, they spend it on robotics, they spend it on artificial intelligence, they spend it on quantum computing, military use, dual-use technology, Belt and Road Initiative, all the things that the Western free countries doesn't want them to do, which becomes a huge competition for the West. And then China is splurging their money on investment in Africa and Latin America, all on infrastructure. Those people don't gain much. Chinese government send their own engineers, their own materials, everything from China. Even maintenance, China has to do it. Right now, these countries are realizing the problem. Last year, 20 representatives from 20 African countries went to China to renegotiate loan payment because African countries are not able to pay back the loans. And what has China done in Asia? Because for China, they reinvented the land Silk Road and also work on the maritime Silk Road. So for maritime Silk Road from South China Sea, Malacca Strait is the most important strait through which all the goods could go in the region. And then Cambodia, now 35–40% in debt with China. They are not able to pay back the loans, so they took a part of the Sihanoukville port, which is a very strategic port in the region. China had taken over the Coco Islands in Burma, which still is a huge threat, security threat to India. And China has taken over the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, again, very close to India. Then what happened to Maldives with President Muizi trying to curry up to Xi Jinping and all that? Now he may be changing a little bit. I thought that was the worst decision the president has made for his country. If they think that India is the frying pan, then I say they are jumping into the fire cauldron if they are dealing with China. And China has already taken over the Gwadar port. Every one of us knows. Where is Gwadar port? In Pakistan, in Balochistan, right? There, the port was built by Chinese. Pakistanis were not able to pay the money. They took over the port, and they're connecting Gwadar port with mainland China through what they call as China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, with $60 billion investment. And I just heard about 10 days ago a Pakistani minister for the first time saying that CPEC is not helping Pakistanis. So this gives China access from mainland China through land to Gwadar port and access to the whole of Arabian Sea. Then we all know about China's relation with Pakistan, higher than sky, higher than mountain, no, sky, deeper than ocean, sweeter than honey. That's how China defines Pakistan-China relations, all-weather friendship and all that. Mainly because they want to contain India. So that is why for decades India's foreign policy is Pakistan, Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, Pakistan. Now India has become bigger. India is not the same India as before, right? And I keep saying you need to stand up for your values. If you don't stand up for your values, then China will treat you like a donkey. They want you to kowtow, bend, bend, bend. Chinese say kowtow. That means vassalage and, so you bend more and more. Right now you are on your 2 legs. Then you will be on your 4. You will become like a donkey and Chinese will keep riding you. That's what they are good at. But if you stand up for your values, they will respect you. So that is something that the West has to learn. And other people who don't understand about China has to learn. And some of my friends say, oh, the dragon has become very big and dragon is biting at us. And I tell them, who made the dragon so big? Dragon at one time was very weak. China was very weak. It's United States. You don't have to read too many books. I tell the US citizens also, read one book, Kissinger on China. That alone is enough to tell you a complete story about how US supported China when it was about to break up or fall down. EU's investment in China, Taiwan's investment in China, Japanese investment in, All these countries are responsible for making what China is today. And China, by any means, whether stealing or through legal means, they do it. For them, international law is a law if it helps them. It is not a law if it does not help them, because International Commission of Juris decision on South China Sea, they are not accepting it. So that's how world is being run today. China is using its influence, so you need to understand the motivations of Chinese government and then understand how you can, respond back to them. And that is what we try to do all the time. Sometimes I thank the Chinese government for being our best publicity agent. Just one anecdote, I was going to Australia. Before I reached there, they have already spread, because the Chinese ambassador had written a 2-page note protesting my visit to Australia, and also protesting one event at the Australian Press Club. We booked a press conference, and they were really pissed off. So they wrote this 2-page letter, and the Australian Press Club didn't like it, so they, of course, let it go, and it was already printed in the newspaper. The Chinese ambassador had protested such and such thing. And then when our representative went to work out the details, then the press club suggested, why you are doing it on Tuesday? Why don't you do it on a Wednesday? Because the next day, because Wednesdays, it's ministers, prime ministers, and foreign dignitaries speak, and this will go live on Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So we changed that to Wednesday. I got the opportunity to speak for 1 hour, 10 minutes live on Australian Broadcasting Television. And then I thank the Chinese ambassador for being our best publicity agent. So we have to know, by understanding China, we have to know how to handle them. If you don't understand China, you will never ever be able to handle them. You will remain in awe of them, thinking, oh, it's a big nation, we can't fight against Chinese. That's not the case, and that's not how it should be. You should understand your neighborhood if you want to be an expert, at least on geopolitics. And today, I come and speak to you, but every single evening I have to read, I have to watch news to be able to tell other people that as we speak, this is going on. So you have to be updated all the time about global politics, the global political dynamism, and how it could go where. And of course, traveling to so many different countries also gives you a lot of exposure, not just reading from newspaper, but meeting people individually and talking to them about their political situation does help us a lot. So I'm here to spread little awareness on Tibet. I hope you did gain little knowledge, and then when you grow up, you will spend more time studying your neighborhood, understanding then if you feel that Tibet needs your support, then you can be committed to it. By understanding the situation, you will support. It will not be a shallow support. So we will keep trying. We will never lose hope. Till the Tibetans inside are not free or till they are not happy, we will keep struggling from outside. And we will never lose hope. As His Holiness says, never give up. We will never give up. But as you grow, we need your support. That is why I am here. So thank you very much.